This is an interesting new phenomenon. Well, to us new, but obviously the Gardaí and other police forces around Europe have been aware of this and making good headway in it. But it's basically a money laundering service that has sort of sprung up as a result of the war in Ukraine. So what you have is the movement of a huge amount of people, and Ukrainian people are still on the move. They're uh, often carrying cash, which they will say, and sometimes legitimately is life savings and stuff that they're afraid to leave because of the banking system in Ukraine. And what they're doing is a number of things, but gangs have sprung up in Ireland, in the UK, and really across Europe, offering a money laundering service to criminal networks. So sometimes they're literally buying the cash.
Yeah.
You know, drug dealers have an unfortunate little problem that they're left with an awful lot of cash that they need to do something with, and you can't just walk into the bank and put it through the system. We've spoken about the Hawala system, the sort of trust system that exists for big bucks. And there's a Chinese system that Eamon Dillon has been talking to us about as well, which is similar.
A similar honour system, I suppose, where you know you make a call and say, I've received this money in Ireland, and then you call somebody in China who lets the fund, who releases the funds effectively.
Exactly. And really the cash gets to a destination ultimately, and usually when it does, it will then be purchased sometimes by the likes of Ukraine, where there's an awful lot of cash going in and out, where there's certain commodities will be worth a lot of money, like vehicles and the likes of that. And obviously the money is also going into Russia. It's then transferred into cryptocurrency, and it comes back ultimately to the guy who owns it in the first place, who has had to sort of entrust it somewhere to have it washed back.
Yeah. So I suppose what we're seeing is Europol, the European-wide police organisation, has targeted at least one Ukrainian-based gang in January, and they arrested 23 people. So what they're saying basically is this gang, it's not a gang that's involved in the movement of drugs or the movement of weapons. They're solely focused on laundering money, and three aspects of it in particular. Cash couriers, so collecting that money in another country, moving it out of the jurisdiction, and then converting it in some way, often through cryptocurrency. And of course, we've had one big case in recent times in Ireland. It sort of went under the radar to an extent. I'll try and pronounce the guy's name.
Alexander Strimbu.
Alexander Strimbu, who was jailed for 5 years last month after being caught with more than 1 million in cash in a house in Knockline in Dublin. And he, I think, is an example of this cash movement business. 1 million he had 1 million in cash in 6 shopping bags, some of it vacuum packed, but pretty haphazard. And he, I think, is accepted by the court that he was a low-level member of this organisation, and he collected that money and then he'd move it on to other people. But that's part of a wider...
Moving it, I think, to various locations in a van. So he was literally the transporter.
Yeah.
He also had an actual cash counting machine on the coffee table of the house when it was raided by the Garda's Drug and Organised Crime Bureau, who are spending more and more time sort of looking at these illicit networks. And there are some people before the courts at the moment, which we can't discuss because their cases are ongoing. But the fact of the matter is that the Gardaí are dealing with intelligence coming in from Europe, but they're also dealing with local intelligence because they can see the kind of activities between certain identified Ukrainian nationals plus the criminal gangs, and they've been watching the money being transferred and building their intelligence around them.
Yeah.
But they're moving the money in. Some of them have legitimate businesses themselves. They're moving the money sometimes physically on their person through airports. And obviously the thing is, if they're caught, they say it's their life savings, and it's that they're afraid to leave it in the banking system. They're sort of refugees as such.
Yeah, because certainly the gang that was targeted in Europe, I mean, a lot of that was they were using their extended family networks or friends. certainly, as soon as the war in Ukraine began, a lot of people liquidated their assets. I mean, that is what happened. That's a fact. So then they would leave Ukraine and they might sell property, sell cars, sell shares, whatever they had. And then they would take out a huge amount of cash out of the Ukraine back into Europe. So they had a whole load of money that was going, and then you could come into the West and say, well, I liquidated my assets, here's 200 grand. So in the middle of all of that, this criminal gang set itself up and started disguising the purchase, the movement of money, as connecting it with the Ukrainian war. Now, also, there's money flowing into Ukraine, certainly from the West to fund the defence. It's not going into a stable environment. So there have been that movement of money in that direction. All of that cash being swapped around gave cover, I suppose, for criminal networks. So we, certainly in Ireland, there have been a lot of seizures. There's been this one conviction, but there's been other seizures as well. And again, that excuse is being put forward. Now, according to Europol, in recent times, they stopped relying on those human couriers and that excuse, and that cryptocurrency has become the big way. That cash courier system that goes to the Ukrainian criminal gang, and then they swap it into cryptocurrency.
But once they get it, into the Ukraine or into Russia,
into Ukraine, Russia, or wherever else, presumably they have a range of networks. But then the cryptocurrency has become. Look, we're only at the beginning of that's the latest technological development, and that features in all of these reports how the various methods that these criminal gangs are ultimately using cryptocurrency to as the final destination for all that crime cash.
Interestingly, the case we can talk about here, Alexander Strimbu, and it was last June when this cash was found in the property he was living in Knockline. He said that he would travel to various locations in this van and hand over Ukrainian banknotes to a person who would then put a bag in the van. He said he'd leave the bags in his room for collection, and he did not know how much the cash was in the bags or where the money came from. He also said he was getting paid. He was not getting paid, but he would get fuel and food.
Yeah.
Now, the Gardaí didn't necessarily agree with that. He was a cog in the wheel as opposed to what he called himself as an idiot. He said, I trusted my relative, so he sort of laid this on a relative. I said I didn't want anything to do with it, but he said I would help him. I didn't want anything for it. Now I'm here. Where's he? And this is a guy with 2 children and parents in the Ukraine. So, I mean, there is obviously stories, and some people will get caught up in this and wrapped up in this. And I'm sure people who are in circumstances of emergency are likely to do anything, really, aren't they, for cash and to get money back to their relatives. But nonetheless, the Gardaí believe this is a more organised thing than this. Strimbu was working in construction here and was already sending home money from Ireland, but now he's working in the prison kitchen 7 days a week, which I don't think he earns a huge amount from. Now, Judge Martin Nolan in that case said that Gardaí believed the money came from the drugs trade.
Yes.
Which is exactly what he's describing as the vital cog in this criminal organisation. So, in other words, there have been connections made between drug gangs here in the UK and, of course, France and Spain and other countries where there are Ukrainian groups have built up through the migration of people over the past few years. And it's a service that obviously a drug gang are going to be very happy to if it works for them, which it obviously does. In the UK in the last month, actually, 2 people were jailed, a similar kind of a story, for 13 years for laundering 6 million. And that was an investigation by the Metropolitan Police's economic crime team. They said this group used criminal money to purchase vans and lorries in the UK. So they would be valuable commodities in Ukraine. And they were kind of using the cover of a sort of an actual business. They would move the vans and the vehicles into the Ukraine and sell them for cryptocurrency.
Yeah.
And that would wash the money back.
I mean, it's a story as old as time itself. Anytime there is a war, these sort of black markets flourish. all through World War II, through countries on both sides of World War II, these black market economies just absolutely spiral, both in Germany and in England, and people will look back at that. So it's another example of this. Europol said that, they describing this operation in which they seized, they seized a huge amount of money. They arrested 23 suspects. There was 91 houses searched, 77 in Spain, France, and 13 in Cyprus. So a lot of it was based in Spain ultimately, and said many millions of, according to Europol, refugees from Ukraine took their savings with them to Europe in cash to safeguard it from the war, and taking advantage of the exceptions put in place to facilitate the transfer of money between jurisdictions, the criminal network moved huge amounts of cash without being questioned in detail or scrutinised during customs checks. And then they said once several cash couriers started being arrested, the criminal network adapted their modus operandi and moved from significant physical cash movements to the cryptocurrency sphere, making the money transfers harder to detect. So according to the initial estimates, at least 75 million euro had moved from March 2023 to the 1 year within that year. So huge amounts of money.
Mm-hmm. And in the UK, the specialist prosecutor for the Crown Prosecution Service in this, Nagin Muktahan, he actually said that this was the second investigation that other members of this same money laundering network had come before the courts in the UK last year. But also pointing out that money laundering is the financial lifeline which enables criminals to profit, like, from their illegal activities. Like, there's no point in having bundles of cash if you can't do anything with it. And together, he said that the defendants in the latest case used an export business as a front to launder millions of pounds of criminal cash across borders. They again were purporting to be legitimate tradesmen. And the fact is, there is a lot of tradesmen, that are working in both countries who would be coming from Ukraine and other Eastern European areas.
So, of course, you actually were in the Ukraine yourself, weren't you?
Just before Christmas, I was in Ukraine, and obviously you can't fly into Ukraine because it's a war zone, so you have to go in over a border. But I found it really quite easy to go in. We flew to Kwiatka in Slovakia, which there is Ryanair flights to from Dublin, and they fly out maybe every Monday and fly back every Thursday. Plane was full. Mainly, I have to say, or a large part of it would have been Slovakians that some of which we, when we got there speaking to law enforcement, they would sort of suggest that there's quite a little network, another little smaller criminal network of people from there flying into Ireland to collect benefits, and then they're flying back because the Ryanair flights are so cheap. So that, they believe, and they were keeping an eye on certain passengers that were on it. But you go into Kwiatka and it's maybe an hour to the border drive. The border had closed actually when we got there, but it was back open in half an hour. I mean, all we had to do was show our passports and you're in. Now, it was at the time that conscription was coming in, and in Ukraine, while we were just in over the border, we didn't actually go deep into it, but there was an absence of young men on the streets, and particularly at night, because there was a fear that they were coming to get them. Do you know
press gang them or whatever they called it,
and in actual fact, when we were coming back out over the border, they were checking boots, and there was a guy not far ahead of us who was taken out of the boot. He was obviously trying to, smuggle himself out of the border. So, look, families, that's small time stuff. Families don't want their young sons going to the front line.
But there's still, I suppose, from what I've read and never been there, you have, but people presume all of Ukraine is a war zone. But of course, it's a huge country. So it's very different depending on where you are. And of course, people also presume Ukraine is a poor country. And obviously, the war is going to have a devastating effect on the economy. But there is still money there, and there is obviously always allegations, particularly out of the Trump administration, about money washing around and corruption. So it's not as straightforward as
it's not only from the Trump administration. In fairness, there has been a lot of concerns about corruption in Ukraine. And as you say, it's a very vast country, and there's a huge amount of money washing in, sort of government funds, as well as charities are, still sending a lot of stuff in through. What do you do? It's a country at war. People need help, and every country, I think, that is in a situation like that, where where the borders are strict as regards who's coming in and particularly who's going out. They're not so strict with what's washing in the supplies into the country.
No.
They have to kind of relax a lot of um, the straight, the around that, because they need the equipment, they need the medical supplies, they need all this sort of stuff, particularly on the front lines. But like Ukraine was operating now, it has changed a bit, obviously, because the drone strikes are happening with Russian. But certainly where we were in it, it was quiet. I mean, there's coffee shops operating, people are walking around the streets, people are going to their jobs.
Yeah.
They're living as normal. It does get really quiet at night. There's that sense of, you need to get in off the streets kind of thing. But restaurants are open, bars are open, hotels are functioning somewhat. I mean, there's no tourism.
No, but I mean, obviously there are other parts of the country where it's a total war zone. Like, that's not to say that it's not, but it's a funny sort of feature. And as I said, like during times of war, I mean, it was, there's great stories in England during World War II about black markets around rations and smuggling and all that. People will have seen it in films. It goes hand in hand.
Yeah, human beings have this survival instinct that we probably don't have to use very much in this country, where we have pretty good. I mean, no matter what, there is massive homeless problem and all the rest of it, but we are a rich country by and large. But you don't have to use your survival skills as much as you do when it comes to wartime. But it's amazing how it kicks in. I remember decades ago now being in Kosovo, at the time of the Kosovan Albanian War. I was in Albania down at the border with Kosovo. And they were opening the border every now and then, and people were flooding into Albania, which was a very poor former communist country. And it just couldn't cope. But it was cold. It was really bloody cold. And there was this kind of really sort of grim border village, which had just become almost like a giant refugee camp. But even the kids had learned survival skills.
Yeah.
I remember being down there I was with a journalist from the UK, from London, from the Telegraph, I think, actually. And we were looking over, we had sort of all arrived and our translators and all the rest of it. And there was this little girl and she had no shoes or socks on her feet. And we were going, oh my God. And here we were, of course, with all the best gear and everything. So actually the girl from the UK took off her very big, thick, almost waterproof socks and handed them to her, and gave her something to put on her feet. And she was thrilled and put them on and ran off. So we went off to do something else and we were back in the same area about 20 minutes later, and there she was with the spare feet again.
Yeah.
Because somebody else is going to give her the socks. On a very tiny level, in a tiny little child's mind, they are still becoming survivalists. They're learning how to trade, how to get commodities that are then worth something.
Yeah.
And no doubt she probably had a little bag full of socks belonging to rich Westerners or whatever,
Yeah, and of course, I was in Beirut, and Beirut is an incredible city. And you can see this, I mean, it's so developed, or at least it was a number of years ago when I was there before the most recent conflict. But you can see this huge wealth, but then you can drive just a very, very short period of time and you're in this area controlled by Hezbollah. And it's just funny when these things can coexist simultaneously. And as we saw in that part of the world in Beirut, that became, we've spoken about it recently, the role that those organizations, how they can link up with criminal gangs. So the Ukrainian war has a fallout, just like the war in the former Yugoslavia had a huge fallout in terms of the rise of organized crime in places like Albania and in Serbia and places like that. So these things go hand in hand, I suppose.
For sure. And it's filtered in now. I mean, the Garda National Drugs and Organised Crime Bureau, they're a constantly evolving policing system, really, in a way. We talk about them homing in on the likes of the gangs like the Family, that they, have been involved in this massive dismantling of the Kinahan organisation in Ireland, that they, they're kind of firefighting the likes of the flashy mob when they start up into feuds in Coolock, North Dublin. You know, they're trying to keep an overview on gangs that are emerging in the west of Ireland and cross-border kind of connections that are being making and all the rest of it. And in the middle of it, something, you know, political, geographical breaks out in another part of the world, and that filters in and changes the criminal landscape here, because they have been for a number of years investigating this kind of Ukrainian
cash couriering business,
cash couriering business, you know.
Yeah.
So there's nowhere escapes. Something happens, something blows up somewhere in the world, and there's a kind of a mass exodus of people. And you know, the vast majority of those people are here looking for sanctuary and looking for a place that they can safely educate their children and make a life until they either go back or they settle here. But there is always going to be a percentage of people looking for opportunities. And my God, has the criminal underworld got opportunities for people who are, you know, a little bit entrepreneurial,
inventive in one way. And of course then the internationalization of crime is one of the other big stories over the last decade. I mean, I think if you look back in the old Sunday worlds from the 80s and 90s, you had stories about Irish bank robbers and English bank robbers travelling over for the weekend to rob banks together and then helping each other out. But that has just gone on, and these things are now so international, and just the digital world allows Ukrainians to be able to make contact with Irish gangs, and just moving across the borders has become just second nature.
Absolutely. So no doubt we'll be coming back and talking about this. And as we said, there are some sort of cases before the courts, which we'll come back to and speak about when they have gone through that system.
Thanks, Nicola.
I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.